Good morning still. Morning. I'm going to do some talking shortly, but before I do, I'd like you to break or embrace the idea that you can have your phone out and you are allowed to look at it whilst I'm talking. So you can, I don't know if this QR code will work, I hope that it does, but get your camera out, click that, should take you to Slido. If the resolution is poor, it doesn't matter, go in your browser, sli.do, and put in that number, and it should take you to a little environment in which you can ask questions. If you're not familiar with Slido, it's a way in which you can submit questions to somebody in a completely anonymous fashion. So there is no way that I or anybody else could connect the question or statement that you made to the person that made it. So what I'd like, if you want, if you have questions, is to ask them through Slido if you don't feel like you want to ask them with your voice, although that too is obviously fine. But I'd also ask you, as I talk and tell a bit of a story, that if there's a part in the story that resonates or impacts you in some way, I would ask that you put it into Slido and just express it in there. So it needn't be questions, you could just say something. And we'll loop back to that at the end. So let's see how we get on. I'm James, and I'm an executive coach. And I help people improve things. I'm also now a motivational speaker. And I would say a mental health advocate, but having listened to Rob just before, I'd also say activist. But I wasn't always what I am now. I used to work with some of you, and I don't mean that figuratively, I mean literally with some of you who've come in to listen today. I worked at Taluna, and before that at Mintel, so I've been in the market research industry for about 20 years. And I largely had a lovely time. When I joined Taluna in 2003, I was all by myself. I was creating a new bit of the business, and things went pretty well, right? The black ones are the target, the blue ones are what I achieved. Not by myself, obviously, there were a bunch of people around me, and I started to hire people into my team. And after a little while, when every year my boss would say, "How's about you give me £1 million more quid?" I'd say, "Yeah, I'll do that. I'll say yes to that, and we'll go ahead and find a way of doing it," which usually meant trying harder, working a bit harder. And by and large, barring 2 of those years, I always did find a way to hit the target that was ever larger than the year before. Sometimes by a lot, sometimes by a little, but it always worked. Saying yes to things worked. And towards the end, you can see, 2018 was a really good year, and 2019 started really well too. Best ever, in fact, best ever start to a year, best ever Q1, which is traditionally quite slow. And around about that time, I was saying yes to a bunch of other stuff, including when marketing look around and say, "There's an event coming up. Who wants to speak at it?" And everybody goes, "Not me. I will avoid eye contact." And I'd go, "I'll do it. Can you do another talk, James?" "Yes, I can." "Can we send you some salespeople from other offices to train in the way that you're doing it?" "Yes, I can." "Can you give more of yourself towards the pursuit of the goals of the company and the people around you?" "Yes, I can." I like saying yes. It was good to say yes because people love it when you say yes. You feel validated and appreciated and wanted, and it's really nice to say yes. So I learned over and over again that saying yes was good. It was an excellent habit to be in. But as I was giving more of my time and more of my energy towards the pursuit of following up with whatever yes I had just said, it occurred to me that I probably need to find some balance. So, was I balanced? Well, I was working by then really hard. Really hard. I also had a couple of children who, well, they were little in the beginning, now they're huge. And I really subscribed to the idea that if I'm working really hard, I'm going to have to play really hard as well for balance. And that manifested for me in lots of different ways. So I like sport and other things. So one of the things that I would do whilst working harder than I had ever worked towards 2017, 2018 is I will play some squash. And because I like targets and I like to beat them, I won't just play squash, I'll play squash until I get into the team. I'll play competitively. Because if I'm not competing and if there isn't a target, what's the point in doing it? Thought I. So I would set myself targets. And since I'm playing some squash and I'm cycling to work every day, I might as well do some triathlons, because why not? And I'm working hard, so I'll play hard. And if I'm doing that, also I'm being a sporty guy, I've always liked rugby, so I might as well add to triathlons and squash and commuting to work playing rugby still. I'm 49 this year, should have stopped playing rugby ages ago, but I've got targets and I want to work hard, I want to play hard. I also like, this is just a way of me showing me in my Spider-Man costume, in the context of me doing sporty stuff with my son. He liked climbing, I like climbing, and why wouldn't you dress up as Spider-Man in a climbing wall? Of course you would. But there's something else going on in my playing hard frame of mind, and that was, I'm quite a social guy, I always was. There's quite a lot of that going on after work or with clients or at an event. I'd be like, excellent, I work hard, I deserve to play hard, so I'm going to have a few drinks. But I wasn't always with people when I was drinking. It wasn't good for me. I was drinking to cope. I was self-medicating to cope with the pressure that I was putting on myself to achieve and say yes and deliver on those yeses. It wasn't my friend, but it became my crutch. I would drink a lot. Quite often at Waterloo, that I've gone through today, quite often I'd go and see clients in London, and I'd go back, I'd miss my train on purpose, and would go and have a drink by myself to just settle something down. I'd think of a reason to have another one by myself so that I didn't go home. Not because I didn't want to go home, I did, I loved my wife, I loved my kids, but I couldn't be asked to do anything else by anyone else that day because I would have said yes and I didn't have it in me, so I'd drink instead. And that did a bunch of stuff to me in my relationships. I wish I'd learned to say no earlier, because it would have changed quite a few things. This is Icarus, and I like that story because I was flying really high and I was doing really well. I was being very successful by all of the measures that I was paying attention to, which were all about targets and achievement and winning and competing. By every measure that I looked at that side of the table, I was doing really well, but there were some other things that I wasn't looking at, and as a result of that, I flew too close to the sun. 3 years ago and a month, roughly, I was at a trade show, not this one, MRS Impact, and that was an impactful show for me those years ago because I had done a whole bunch of shows by then, like that picture of me before at IIEX, where I had said yes to doing the talk on behalf of somebody else because they didn't want to do it. I'd done a lot of shows. And a colleague of mine, who's not here today, but I kind of wish she was, because I think, along with another colleague that is here today, I suspect that they saved my life, actually, because they said, hey, James, how are you? And I did what I always did. I said what I always said, which was to be fine, brilliant, terrific, amazing. I'm excellent, thank you very much. How are you? And they'd go, fine. And we would carry on with the dance of we're all fine. But not that day, not that day. We were sat in a Wetherspoons around the corner from Tower Hill. If you've been to MRS Impact in 2018, 19, whatever, that's where you go after the show to sit in a slightly shit pub to have a drink with your colleagues and take your work face off a little bit. And she said, how are you? And I said, fine, thanks, brilliant. She went, I'm paraphrasing, she largely went, but how are you really? At which point I say, complete surprise to me, at which point I say, I don't think I am fine. This is too hard. I can't do this anymore. That was what I was going to say, but what I said was, I don't think I am and instead of saying fine and all of the other things, I just cried instead, out of nowhere. Rose up unstoppably and I cried, and then the crying turned into sobbing with snot and a red face and the hiccups that come because you're working so very hard to keep it in. I'd been working so very hard to keep things in, and I was surrounded by my peers, my colleagues, people that I respected, people I'd spent 10 years trying to impress and say yes to, and here I am, sobbing in front of the very people I'd been working so hard to present the version of me that I liked, the yes version of me, that was always calm and in control and delivered, no matter what. I liked that version. I had been validated over and over again that everybody else liked that version too. And it was not that it wasn't me, it was a version of me, but I never let what was happening inside out until it burst out. Not really where I wanted it to, burst out all over the place. And that turned out to be the beginning, which I now understand, but I didn't understand at the time, the beginning of a panic attack. And the panic attack lasted for 15 days. Ebbed and flowed, sometimes more acute than others, but it was 15 days. So I did go home late and drunk because my colleagues, who surprised me immediately, by the way, by not ridiculing me or laughing at me or thinking I was being an idiot or weak or foolish, none of those things. All I received in return was empathy and understanding and kindness. What I also received, because I suspect we're all a little bit equipped to deal with somebody that spontaneously cries in a work context, was quite a lot of beers. Let me get you a drink. And I'm like, yes, please, because drink is my friend. And also like one of those rough blue tissues that Wetherspoons use to clean tables. So let me give you a scratchy tissue and several drinks, which I gratefully embraced. They offered me much more than that, in fact. It was just consideration and kindness and empathy and all of those things. But at the time it was booze, so as a consequence of calming down a little bit and having several more drinks, I went home drunk and late, which had become entirely normal for me, to go home a bit late and a bit drunk. So it's not a surprise when I stumble home and disturb my wife with my snoring and fidgeting and all of the rest of it. She wakes up the following day, I wake up the following day. She's legitimately quite annoyed at how I've behaved once again and says, how was last night? And I try to play back the story and say, oh, interesting happened last night. I'm going to tell you an amusing anecdote from yesterday. Someone asked me if I was fine, and I said that I was, and then she said, are you fine really? And I was trying to play back the answer that I had in my head, which was, and then I said, do you know what? I don't think I am fine. But I got as far as the F again. So I went, don't think I am, and then sobbed all over again. And by that time I'd been with my wife for 18 years probably, and that marked the third time she'd ever seen me cry at anything. Births, deaths, children, sad books, whatever. She'd never seen me cry like that, in a way that I couldn't control. And once it started to come out, it poured out. And that was frightening. Deeply frightening to do it twice in 12 hours. Deeply frightening to do for something to happen to me that I could not control. That I couldn't just work harder at to stop. Some other stuff happened, but 15 days later, the physical symptoms of a panic attack and prolonged stress over time and letting go of who I was and a bunch of other things manifested in, I have to skip a few parts because we don't have much time, but I kept trying to go back into work. I'll just go back in and try harder. I shall ignore that, sweep it under the carpet because control is my thing. I'll try harder. It didn't work. I was ignoring what my mind and body were trying to tell me, and the longer I ignored it, the louder the signals got, until 15 days later, even I had to concede that I wasn't well because I had lost the ability to read. I was in the office, in a meeting, I couldn't read. I could understand the word, I could read the word impact, but I wouldn't be able to read any of the other words around it to derive meaning from the combination of those words I couldn't read. And I won't even go into my heart rate and how I wanted to vomit nearly all of the time, every minute that I was in work for that period. And shortly after that, in a totally benign meeting in which I'm basically really full-on panicking now, like a tiger's going to eat me, I can't read, and somebody going, are you okay? What I'm trying to say is fine, thanks, because that's what we say. But I couldn't even say that. So I lost the power of speech shortly afterwards. Couldn't read, couldn't speak. Long gone was my short-term memory, attention span, ability to filter what was important and what wasn't. That had gone several days ago, so I took myself home, reluctantly. My wife suggested that I went to the doctor. Didn't want any of that. Why would I want to admit that I need help? Definitely not. I need to sort this shit out myself because I'm all about control and trying hard. Went to the doctor, took, 3 minutes probably, for him to go, you're not well, you shouldn't be at work, sign you off. And I was simultaneously disgusted that that was true, but also so relieved that I wasn't just imagining it, that somebody could tell me, don't go to work. Turns out that I didn't then go to work until December. So I was off for 9 months, probably. It actually got worse before I got better. All sorts of stuff went on. COVID got invented, and a phased return. Luna were quite good in that regard. They tried to find something that I could do, and I tried to find something that I could do. We were all willing to try and help me come back, but phased returns, as it turns out, are not a linear graph where you start at 0 hours and get to 40 over 90 days, and the graph looks like that. It doesn't. It looks a bit like, shit, I'm back at work. Can I do it? I don't know if I can do it. I don't really want to be here. Yet I do. It's incredibly confusing. So the graph should look a bit like that. It'd take many more than 90 days. But then COVID came along, and for a bunch of reasons, I left Luna. Not in the manner of my choosing, but I understood it, and actually definitely was the right thing to happen, because I wouldn't be here doing this stuff now. And I started talking, and I found out that it's funny what happens when you tell the truth to people. Quite often they'll tell you the truth in return. So if we're all projecting that we're perpetually fine at all times, that's all you'll get back, by and large. So I started telling people how I was, which very often was quite shit, actually. And then somebody would go, actually, I don't feel particularly great at the moment either. So with some empathy, perhaps, and some openness and some communication, I started to realise it's quite good telling the truth, as it turns out. Skipping forwards, I decided that mental health was important and that we all had it, whether we know it or not. So I decided I'd learn a bit more about that and go on a mental health first aid course, which is about a year ago, year and 2 weeks, something like that. Wow, I wish I'd done it a long time ago. I wish doing a mental health first aid course or an awareness course was a mandatory part of being a people manager. If we're going to look after people as a manager, manage people, we ought to really understand not only how to try and motivate them into delivering more on our behalf to the company, but also that it might not always be easy, and they might need some help from time to time. So I did the course with that in mind, but I didn't realise how much I'd learn about me. This photo here is my workbook. And I was setting about, this is, if you can read that from the back, this is what is an anxiety disorder. This is in the stress and anxiety chapter. And I was just highlighting all the things that I had felt. And in that moment, I realised I had been feeling anxious for a really long time. There's a thing in there called the Goldberg Anxiety Scale, which clinicians will use to help, not to diagnose, but to indicate a move towards a possible diagnosis. That's what it is. In the past month, have you had any of those? But it means repeatedly. It doesn't mean once. You can have, the indicator is if you've got any more than 6 of those over a prolonged period of time, we should probably investigate further. There might be something going on. It's perfectly okay to feel anxious from time to time, or nauseous, or like I did last night, wake up every 40 minutes all night worrying about whether I'd be interesting and if anybody would come and if it would make sense. I spent all night worrying about that. Also had a funny dream in which my opening slide was me and my family naked on a beach. I don't know what my subconscious is trying to tell me, other than probably exposure. I'm worried about being exposed and embarrassed in front of people. So the fact that I experienced a bunch of this stuff last night and some nervous wheeze this morning doesn't mean I've got an anxiety condition, but if that happened every day, as it did a few years ago, that's probably worth checking out. So as I reflected doing this course, I exhibited continuously for 18 months at least 8 out of 9. I had grown used to experiencing 8 out of 9 of those symptoms more or less every day, continuously for a couple of years, because I said yes to everything all the time. I mentioned truth before. It's funny what happens when you tell the truth. I showed you a picture of me and my rugby mates a little bit earlier. So here's another picture of me and my rugby mates. This is 2019, October the something or other, when we have just knocked New Zealand out in the quarterfinals of the Rugby World Cup. So of the 11 people there, 10 of us are happy. Poor Al is not so happy. He's a Kiwi, and we've just knocked him out of the World Cup and then laughed about it. Rugby clubs are famous for lots of stuff, if you've ever played. Camaraderie, brilliant. being naked a lot of the time, another one, but it's a confrontational, roughy-tufty, masculine-y sort of a vibe going on. What's not famous for is talking about how you feel, or your feelings, like you have to be a certain type of character. Obviously, masses of boozing as well. But it was interesting because I had begun to tell people how I really felt. And I didn't stop there either, so I started to tell these guys, who we've all been naked many times and vulnerable in that sense, but never emotionally vulnerable. And they'd say, how are you? And I'd say, actually, I'm off ill from work, from stress. And they'd be like, oh, you don't look like the kind of guy that would be off. Like I see you as the guy that scores tries and tackles people and cuts them in half with great violence. Well, not literally. You don't seem like the kind of guy that would suffer from stress. I'm like, what do they look like then? And because I started telling them the truth, some of them, not all of them, they all would tell me the truth. But as it turns out, I'd been playing rugby with for 15 years or more with people who also needed help from therapists from time to time, who also felt so sick in the morning that they couldn't go to work or had to have time off, or pretend that it was the flu, but it wasn't. They just couldn't go to work that day. I'd been surrounded by them for years in the most masculine environment that I could put myself in, were the very people that would have understood. If only I had known that. And they didn't know it of me until I told them, so that's a funny sort of paradox, isn't it? Wish I'd told them years ago, and as I've wandered around delivering talks, as I do now, and coaching people and all the rest, I've found out over and over again that I'm not advocating, by the way, that we bare our hearts every time somebody says, how are you? And you go, well, let me tell you, I've got a lot of stuff going. Sometimes it is just the polite social dance in which the only answer you really want is fine, thanks, let's move on. That's fine, but if you want to know the difference, if you want to indicate to somebody that you actually do mean, how are you, expect that they'll say fine, unless you come from basically anywhere else that's here. If you go to most European places, if you ask them people how they are, they will tell you. And they've had to learn how ridiculous we are here, that we ask questions we don't want to know the answers to nearly constantly, which is ironic in the research context too, because we certainly do ask some weird questions in research projects. Just ask them again. How are you? Fine, thanks, blah, blah, blah. But how are you really? It's not like a punchy interrogation. It's like, how are you really? And if they go, yeah, actually, I'm fine. Okay, I've asked again. So I've learned some things, and part of this, there is a bit of catharsis going on because I lost my shit at a trade show. So I wanted to know if I could come back to one and talk about this stuff in the very context where it all tipped me over, and I've just done that. So I feel pleased about that. But I've learned some other stuff, so if you'll allow me, I shall offer you some things, some unsolicited advice, which no one likes, but anyway. I've learned some things. This stuff's better out than in. You leave it in there. Firstly, you can't really understand it. It festers. It's toxic. It's confusing. It's like, funnily enough, in your talk earlier, where do you feel things? And I feel it here. I feel it here. This is where I feel afraid or heartbroken or embarrassed or ashamed. It's not really up here. It's in here. But when I'm not talking about it, I understand it less. When I do say it out loud, fear loves the dark. Say your fears into the light, and they're not so scary anymore. So say it out loud. Or write it down. Just get it out somewhere. You'll understand it better. And there can be a time and a place for that. It's not everywhere. It's not all the time. But you can create a time and a place for that to be appropriate. And it's not selfish. I hear it all the time. Oh, sorry, James, for telling you all this stuff. Like, what are you sorry for? I asked you. What's to be sorry for? And now that you've expressed something to me, it makes me more able to express something to you. Mutually beneficial, open relationships happen. You can make a time and a place for that. I felt broken and alone and ashamed and embarrassed and confused, but mostly alone for a really long time. And whilst I felt it, it wasn't true. I wasn't alone. I just didn't know who I was sat next to. There's loads of empty seats in here, and I reckon I could just take a chance and sit next to somebody, and there's it's an echo chamber. You've come to talk about burnout. You're probably interested in it. But I could probably sit next to somebody that is interested and would understand in here, but I could go out there and do it. I could go to any stand and find somebody who's been secretly shitting themselves about coming to a talk or doing a talk, or standing on a stand, or whether or not they'd made enough client contacts to sell. And if I went, how are you really? They'd be like, oh, thank God I can answer the question properly for a minute, just to take off that face and go, oh, let some stuff out. They'd feel a bit better. You're not alone. I was pouring from an empty cup for a really long time, and you can't do that forever. You can't pour from an empty cup. You've got to take a rest. I'm properly outside of my comfort zone today. I would be much more comfortable sat at home in my Spider-Man costume watching Netflix. This is an well, some people know that I'd just do it anyway, because why wouldn't you? But this is not a comfort zone for me. I've had to spend really all week charging up for this, and when I'm finished, I'm going to have to take a breather. I'm going to have to be really conscious of what this took to do it, and I'm going to consciously try and charge it back up before I say yes to a bunch of other stuff. It's fine to put your shoulder to the wheel, but just not all the time. Not even going to say anything about that. Help's helpful. Support is supportive. It doesn't make you stupid or weak to ask for it. The clue's in the term. I only ever cared about the crop, the production, the yield, the efficiency. Never occurred to me to look after the soil from which that was born. Your crop will fail if you don't look after the soil from time to time. Doesn't mean it's a waste. You're just preparing to be able to do it again. So, it's advice time. What advice would I give my former self if I could do the time machine thing? Nearly nothing would be the answer. Nothing that I would have listened to, because I was fine, wasn't I? Just look at the numbers. It's working. Fine. I wouldn't have taken any advice. Stubborn as I was. Proud, probably. I possibly would have listened to that. Enjoy the moment, enjoy the wins a little bit, because then they don't come along every day, so when they do, sit with it, work really hard to get them. Don't just dive into the next one. But questions I might have engaged with. So if there was somebody that could have asked me questions, that's what Rob said before, have good questions. I might have asked myself, the pace that you're working at, how sustainable is that? What is it costing you to work to that pace? If I was really brave, I'd say, what would be the cost to your wife of you being late and pissed every day? What's the cost to your children? Is it worth it, this pursuit of target, which, by the way, I'd conflated happiness with and satisfaction? Once I get there, I'll be happy. Oh no, the target's moved. Right, I shall redouble my efforts and pursue it, because once I get there, I'll be happy. Sort of forgot about the journey part, which is the only bit we're actually on. Comparison's an interesting thing. How do I feel compared to yesterday? Well, majorly, marginally better or marginally shitter than yesterday. So comparing yourself to yesterday doesn't really help. But if somebody had said, how are you? And how does that compare to a couple of years ago? I'd be like, ooh. Okay, it isn't normal to wake up 5 days a week, 3 times a night, completely drenched in sweat, which I did. I'd wake up totally sweaty, gross, go and get a towel, dry myself off, and then go back to sleep on the towel 3 or 4 days a week. How'd that compare to yesterday? No different. I did that yesterday. How'd that compare to 3 years ago? Vastly different. Maybe you should take a look at that. Okay, so if I was a leader, and some of you will be, some of you will run businesses or teams or be of influence, what advice would I offer? Well, I'm framing it as if it's myself. No, I'm giving it to you. People follow examples, I suspect, rather than PowerPoints. So I'd have a little look at the examples that you're setting, consciously or unconsciously. What are they? But by the way, I'm not pointing fingers about what they might be. I just really would invite you to have a look at what they are currently and just be conscious of them. And are they examples that you would like to set? How well are you looking after your soil? So there's a hidden question before that, which is, are you? Harvard Business Review, read it the other day, thought I'd put it in there to imply that I'm well read. No, I just saw it on LinkedIn, thought it was nice. But they were talking about wellbeing programs and initiatives and all that kind of thing. And they basically concluded that it's great to have that stuff, and you should, and that's important. But what people need is not advice, per se. What you need to provide, as well as access to those things, but you really need to help them carve out the time to use them. Because I'm not sure that people are. I think it's like, great, it's there, thank you very much, but I'm too busy to use that stuff because I'm so busy pursuing the goals of the company. So if I ran a company now, I'd be thinking, firstly, what examples do I set in my usage of the things that I am espousing, or that I've got HR to go and buy on our behalf? How do I use those things? Because people will follow what I do far more than what I say. That, provide them with human stories, because I think we all know that people follow stories. They follow stats too, but they follow stories more. So where are the stories in our organisation that proves that isn't a box-ticking exercise, but we've got senior leaders talking about, comfortably, how they get help or seek support, because help's helpful and support is supportive. Finally, be more John. Who's John? This is John Wanamaker. He's an American guy, and he was the Postmaster General, amongst other things. And John said wise words, which I'll let you read for yourself. I thought, shit, that's good, because I didn't make time for my wellness, and I really did have to make 18 months or so for my wellness, actually, and counting, because I'm not better. I'm better than I was in the middle of 2019, but I'm not better. I failed to consider that that was important. And you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a contemporary remark from somebody with their finger on the pulse of well-being at the moment. No, he died 101 years ago. He had a good idea. So, that'll do for me talking. I can't remember where my phone is. But I'd love to hear from you for a couple of reasons. One is because I shall wander out of here feeling ever so slightly less insecure about whether this was any good than when I started. So it will help me to hear, I'm not fishing for compliments, that's not what I mean. But I really found it difficult to articulate clearly how I felt, but it really helped to start. So I'd just love to hear what you thought, if it brought something up for you, or whatever. And it's nice to meet new people too, so I'd love to hear from you. Go on then.
So, in general, men are less likely to talk about their feelings than women. So how do you, why didn't you, what was your breaking point? Why didn't you speak to your wife, for example, how you feel, before you spoke to your colleagues?
So to repeat your question, in general, women are better at talking about this stuff than men are. Feelings. Yeah. Why didn't I speak to my wife about how I felt? Is that a fair reflection? Because I was so busy trying to say yes to her all the time and be the version of me that I thought she wanted to, which was the strong one and the predictable. I didn't want her to worry about money and any of those things. I was so busy delivering to what I thought she wanted. I got that massively wrong because she only told me about a year ago. We talk now. That's good. I tell her how I feel, she tells me how she feels, much better. The other thing I'd say is I no longer try to solve her problem when she's halfway through talking about it, because that's properly annoying. You're just expressing what happened in a day, and somebody goes, why don't you just, can you just... I'm just trying to say something out loud to answer your question. Why didn't I? I was afraid, I was embarrassed, I didn't want to admit that I wasn't the version that I thought she wanted. But what really, really shocked me about a year ago is she said, you remember those times when you were working hard and making loads of money, all the rest of it? She's like, I thought you were having an affair. Because I got back late and drunk all the time. And when she said, how are you? I'd go, fine. Didn't look fine. was uncommunicative and emotionally withdrawn, and every time I told her it was fine, look at the numbers, she filled in the blanks for herself and thought, well, he must be having an affair then, therefore it must be me, as in her. It must be her that's at fault. So I wasn't just hurting myself, I was hurting her. Funny enough, I was having an affair, not with a person, but with my job. That's what I gave all my love and commitment to. There's nothing left over for me or for her. So I just felt ill-equipped, and I didn't know how, I'd never been taught. You're right, generally speaking, men aren't fabulous at talking about their emotions, but in my experience, that doesn't mean that they can't, just needs someone to go first. I'll go first, I'll tell you how I feel. And almost always, let's discard gender, that person will feel slightly more comfortable telling you how they feel because you went first, so go first. It's a great question, thank you. I'm just going to check if we've got any slider. Ooh. Also, I need reading glasses, and that's super annoying. I should have got that. How can I tell whether I'm burned out with the pressure of work or just the work I'm doing now? Whether changing job might help fix the feeling of self-ruin? Thank you, person who asked that question. How can I tell whether I'm burned out with the pressure of work or is it just the work I'm doing now? I would take the onus of responsibility off yourself to determine that, because it's really hard to self-diagnose, just as it's really hard to go and reach that help if you leave it till crisis, because that's when you're least equipped to be coherent and logical. So I would advocate to this person that I would begin with talking it out with some people, finding a friendly ear, possibly a professional even, if you have access to EAP programs, employee assistance programs and helplines and the like. They're really good at it. They're really good at listening. So I would just start by talking it out and then reflecting on how long this is going on for, because it is okay to put the effort in for a short-term project. So it's about the length of time that you might have been feeling that way, but don't try and figure it out by yourself because it's really hard.
James, unfortunately, I am going to have to stop you there. Ladies and gentlemen,